Today is truly all about sharing stories. We all have a story, don't we? We all have our own personal story, and each of our stories is so rich. It's about healing. It's about finding our strength. An anonymous author said, "Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness, nor a lack of faith. It is the price of love."
As a young woman married to a young man in a hazardous profession, I had reason to ask myself whether I could imagine life without Drew, and the answer was emphatically no. And when he was killed, the pain and the grief were everything I had feared. And then some. I described it at the time as akin to having a limb torn off, a kind of invisible maiming. Self-euthanasia seemed like a good idea at the time, a desirable blessing that only the needs of my 4 grieving children really rendered unthinkable. And so I think it's normal and even necessary for any of us to say, this is who I am, this is what I need in order to survive, to be happy and whole. This is what I cannot live without. This is who I cannot live without. And sometimes what and who we cannot imagine living without is our own health and strength. Sometimes it's the assurance that we live in a safe and predictable world. I wanted to live in a world where my husband couldn't be taken from me. He was. Right now, I want to live in a world in which service is never met with murder. A world in which my baby girl's courage couldn't possibly result in her death. A world where someone could not walk up to my child in her uniform and shoot her. I couldn't bear it. Sometimes, after a loved one dies, the bereaved really can't go on. Sometimes that happens. I guess there are people who really can't bear being incapacitated, who can't handle dying of cancer or Lou Gehrig's disease. They just can't do it. Sometimes there are people who predict they'll be unable to handle being with their loved one when he's dying or she's dying. And sometimes they turn out to really be crummy at it. That happens. I mean, it's not like you can become a whole different person just because life is making a whole new set of demands on you, right? What hospice people know, what you'll remind me of when the time comes, is that faced with terminal illness, faced with death and loss, people grow into who they need to be in order to love more.
On Thursday, May 10th, 2007, John died, and I had to go on without him. And I'd like to provide a little bit of context, because I think we can agree that not all losses are the same. And for those of you that were here last year, you heard me talk about losing my mom. And I had, in fact, just lost my mom last year. And I talked about the importance of advance directives last year. And she didn't have one, which is why I, in fact, spoke about it. And I loved my mom, and I still do. But her death impacted me differently. And I took my 3 days, then, we had 3 days, off from work, and I was okay to go back. So you might be sitting here right now thinking, how does this relate to grief in the workplace? Well, so John died on a Friday. There was an autopsy. There was an autopsy on Monday. Friends and family came in from out of town. A funeral was planned for Wednesday, which is remarkable that all of that happened so quickly. And my 3 days were up. In fact, I was already 1 day over. And on Thursday, my CEO called and asked if he and the director of HR could come by for a visit. And I thought, wow, how wonderful. These two gentlemen are coming by for a support visit. But the real reason was to ask, when are you coming back to work? I hadn't even thought about work. But I understood. When they got there, I understood. I was a very busy person. I had a senior level job, and I had a team of very busy managers reporting to me. So I used vacation days for the rest of the week because I still had his family in my home. And then I went back to work on Monday. But I was actually pretty lucky because I had a remarkable team who supported me, and I had a wonderful, wonderful assistant who I always referred to as my gatekeeper. And she knew when I was having good days and not so good days. And a bad day or a bad moment could happen without warning. And sometimes I felt so alone because people would steer clear of me, and they would be afraid of me if I showed the tiniest bit of emotion. Because after all, I was a woman executive in a business world, and I was supposed to be so stoic, but yet I had come apart at the seams. And now I'm so proud that as the CEO of Hospice of Southern Maine, we've been able to increase our bereavement leave to up to 7 days to support our employees during such difficult times. And as I mentioned earlier, losses can be different for some, and 7 days may not be necessary, but for others, it absolutely will be. And for some, they'll need more time. And in addition to the bereavement leave, we also offer an employee assistance program. And of course, we're very fortunate that we have Carol and her team. Plus, we also have a group of wonderful chaplains and social workers, and you may have seen some here today. I know Larry Greer is here. I've seen him a few times, and I know we have some wonderful social workers here in the audience, too. And if our employees need to talk, they reach out to them. But not all companies have on-site experts that certainly know how to manage grief like ours do. So my message to other CEOs is to know that grief in the workplace exists, to recognize it, and just support your employees. Both those dealing with grief themselves and those working side by side with the employees experiencing it. And allow employees to express what's going on. Let them set the pace and the tone about how to talk about it or not talk about it. Don't insist or say that things will be okay or set a timetable. I had a dear friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, give me a card, and on the front of it said, "Snap out of it." I guess she thought I had grieved enough. And try not to praise their strength. and that's a funny one. I had days that I ran incredibly successful meetings. I worked on complicated projects, yet I barely felt that I made it through the day, and I felt anything but strong. And finally, just be understanding and have an open heart. And thank you so much for listening.
In the immediate aftermath of a loss, you often get a big surge of adrenaline, and you've got all these people there with you, and you're planning the funeral or you're doing whatever. When that wears off, and now you just have to get on with life without the person you love, that can be very draining and exhausting, and just being very clear, at least with yourself, about and accommodating for yourself of what that really means, and take care of yourself that way.
Our daughter, Ashley A.J. Johnston, died by suicide on June 3rd, 2013. She had so many friends come and tell us stories as to how she had helped them out of bad situations and how she helped so many people. We were so fortunate to have that support from the people of East Point Christian Church and the life group that we were part of at the time. And especially the help of Carol here, who stayed with us for a year because we were so blindsided. We just didn't know how to take all of this. I've known since Ashley's passed away. She was our youngest of 4 children. She was only 23. That life is short. We never know when our time is going to be up here on earth. And we need to do the things that matter in this world. And for me, it's been helping others through education and being a good listener and comforter by participating and being a field advocate for the AFSP. So these are the things that have helped me since Ashley's passed away.
So we knew that he was using, and so even though there was that initial shock of finding him and going through this process, we knew that that was a high-risk activity. So, the shock did wear off, and then it was intense sadness, which I'm sure everybody in the panel has experienced. But then came some other emotions that are, a little bit harder to sit with. And I suspect Margie and I have one thing in common, is that these were our children. We have always been socialized as parents, is that we protect our children. We weren't able to do that. Anyways, I'm better now. I've gone through treatment, but I've retired. I have a lot of good things in my life now.
I lost my dad December 6, 2015. My journey, and I do compare it to that. Grief is a journey. The first weeks after were almost a numbness and a survival mode. And I know Tom talked about his relationship, and anybody that is going through grief, if you have a spouse, I can't say this enough, I have a wife who loves me dearly. We were high school sweethearts. I knew and thought we'd be married forever, and we still are because of her. She fought for me during those very dark times, and that's part of grief. And one of the other things that I did, I had started hiking the 48 4,000 footers. So any of you going through grief, if you want to walk it off, it's a great start. I had already started it, and then I lost my dad, and I had only hiked about 16, and it became a new journey. And the people that I was hiking with were saddened by they said, well, you just hiked 5 mountains by yourself. Yeah, I did. It was good. And I was able to meet a lot of people. I met some people who were hiking the Appalachian Trail, who were hiking off the war, which was just amazing to me. And so there's a lot to be said about that reconnecting with nature. And the other part is it forced the spirituality for me to examine. For whatever you believe or whatever you choose to believe in, I think it just forced me to understand and examine things in my own life in a different view.
So in 2009, just gotten married, January 4th, and 4 days later, my son, 26-year-old son in California, was rushed to the hospital and found out that he had brain tumors. And he died about a year later. So from January 2009 to the spring of 2010. The final part of that first 3 months that is really present in my memory is how sad I was for my other son, the surviving son, because he lost his brother. And that actually, my grief over his grief, my sadness over his sadness, is much greater than mine, because he'll have it long after I'm gone. You know, he'll be missing his brother. And he said that when Andy died, he felt like he lost his emotional DNA. So I can't fix that. So those were the first few months. I don't know how anybody could go back to work after 1 or 2 or 3 days. You know, I haven't seen Andy in 8 years, and it does not get easier. And now I know that, and so I can really empathize with people who feel that way. It's you know, why would it be less? Why would it be less? Each year is actually harder. I miss him more. I want him back more. And, you know, I think of today, yesterday actually was the beginning of Brain Tumor Month, which is also Mother's Day, and the month he died, and it's just a big month. So what I decided to do on Facebook was put a picture each day of something that he loved and that he would be loving today if he were here. And so I carry him, you know, like the baby he was inside me. I totally carry him with me everywhere. I feel pretty strong. Yeah, pretty fierce.
Watching your wife die, your loved one, your soulmate die, there's no words for it. It was, I can still picture that day, the whole scene in slow motion. It was just numbing. After I was able to collect myself, I kind of had to figure out, like, how do I do this? Because not only did I just lose my wife, my spouse, my soulmate, I now had to drive home and confront my 4 children. I've never had loss before. Like, I guess I kind of had an easy life. I've never really lost anyone I loved or anyone I was close to before. And I always had this picture of grief being, okay, every day I get better, and then soon it's going to be over. You know, and so coming to that realization that, okay, this is part of me. Grief is part of me. It's going to be part of me forever. That was just kind of a huge thing for me. But I think, like, the biggest thing for me, the biggest growth is being here today. I mean, that's huge.
I have certainly had my own experiences with loss, beginning with the loss of my husband in 1996. He was a state trooper and he was killed in the line of duty, and I had 4 small children at the time. The most moving thing about the panel of grieving people was, first of all, their honesty, how completely honest they were with a large audience about what their experience had been, and not only the ways that they sort of succeeded and triumphed over grief or anything, but really the ways that they could have done it better, you know, the things that they don't feel went as well. I thought that was honest and empowering and helpful. throw out there for people is to remember, both for themselves and for anyone they know who's grieving, is that the first Christmas, let's say, after your loved one dies may not be the hardest one, because that's the one you know, that's the one you're anticipating. It's the following year. Because instead of the emergency Christmas, the memorial service Christmas, the now we're grieving Christmas, you have now this is normal Christmas. And he's not here, or she's not here. And now this is our tradition. Hospice of Southern Maine provides grief support for everyone in the community, anyone in the community, regardless of whether they or their loved one died in hospice care. And the resource is free. It's free to anyone in the community. So that is actually an extraordinary thing, and something that I know that I tell people about, and that I would like more people to know about.